something that the song there captures so well about, they call us crazy, they'll tell us we've lost our minds, that as planners, we planned for this. And then all of a sudden, from both sides of our oceans, the message was that this was unpredictable, unprecedented, unique, never been seen before. So not only did things happen that we hadn't expected in terms of decisions made by central government, but also we were being told that we didn't exist. And then what was truly incredible was the most brilliant book, and I just don't know how she's managed to put this together, appeared about our field, about disasterology, about being a disasterologist. And just like the song there conveys, the other wonderful thing about the book is that it obviously begins with the Hugh Jackman, the film, and the Greatest Showman connection is that the film begins with the dreams of Hugh Jackman. And Sam's book opens with her own personal account. It's memoir, but it's also, as her description describes, it's expert analysis as well. It's passionate, and we love that. We need that, and it's a personal account of a country in crisis. Now, I know I've already asked you to buy one book. Yesterday, I asked you to buy Jill Koenig's book. In fact, I demanded that you bought the book. I'm making the same request here. You have to buy this book, Disasterology: Dispatches from the Frontline of the Climate Crisis. You actually haven't got long to buy it because there is a paper crisis in the world, so you need to buy it today. Sadly, it has to be bought this afternoon. The other thing that Sam did so incredibly well, that nobody had ever done for me this well, is merge the front line, as she calls it, of the climate crisis with our passion as disasterologists. So that was something that I was desperately waiting for somebody to do, and there it was. Dr. Samantha Manzano, thank you so much for making time for us today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Lucy. That was so nice. I am honored to be here with you all today. I'm really looking forward to this talk specifically. I think for many of the reasons that Lucy mentioned, I think that sometimes in the field of disaster management, we can kind of spend a lot of time talking about the nitty-gritty operational things. And I think it's really important, especially at this particular moment in time, in the midst of the pandemic and kind of at the start of the climate crisis, to take some time and take an opportunity to be more reflective as a discipline, as a profession, as a group of people who have the best interests of our future at heart, and think about what changes we need to make internally, even in our mindset of how we're coming to this work, but also what we need to be doing, or how we can try and influence the external forces that, of course, bring such a bearing on the work that we do. So hopefully this presentation can kind of be an opportunity for some reflection, to kind of chart where we've been, where we are now, and potentially where we could go in the future. This is going to, I'm not going to be going over any specific research or anything in this presentation. I kind of just want to kind of open the floor and be able to be a bit more conversational here about, again, that reflection of where we are right now in this moment in time. So I generally like to start the talks that I give by explaining a little bit of my background and kind of how I came to disaster management, how I have come to understand what the problems are in our field, and how I have come to think about potential solutions down the line. So I first got started doing disaster work in New Orleans, Louisiana, after Hurricane Katrina and the levee failure in 2005. I was 16 when Katrina happened, and I lived on the East Coast of the United States, so very far away from New Orleans. I was very far removed from Katrina. I watched it on the news, but past that, I really hadn't thought that much about it. And but luckily I had the opportunity to go and volunteer in New Orleans, just for a week, go down, help tear down houses, help rebuild houses. And I got to New Orleans, and the kind of full scope of destruction and kind of the depth of destruction just slapped me across the face. I got there and we're driving mile after mile, and it's every single house, every single building has been flooded, are in various stages of collapse. There are these just mountainous piles of debris lining every single street. And 80% of the city had been underwater. The entire city needed to be rebuilt. There were over 1 million people who needed to rebuild their entire lives. And it was this crisis of such a scope and scale that prior to actually seeing it with my own eyes, I couldn't even fathom how this could be, how this could happen. And while I was there, I at first was very shocked by the extent of those impacts, just seeing those piles and piles of debris. But as kind of the couple days went by, I started to become even more shocked and more concerned with the extent of the need in New Orleans. Every single person in New Orleans needed something, and many people needed many things. And there were certainly people there who were trying to help, right? People like me who were there volunteering. There were, a tremendous number of nonprofit organizations that had come to the city, that had been created in the city in response specifically to Katrina, that were doing incredible work. But even then, there was this obvious lack of assistance, and particularly in the sphere of government. There were, news story after news story of these billions of dollars that the federal government was sending to New Orleans, using for the recovery. And when we looked around, we didn't see government. It was us. It was the volunteers. It was these nonprofits, and it was New Orleanians that were there on the ground doing this work. And I ended up moving to New Orleans. So I lived in New Orleans, and I worked on the recovery for over 4 years, working with these different nonprofit organizations, doing, every kind of recovery task you can imagine, kind of whatever needed to be done in the city. And throughout the course of those 4 years, I never once met an emergency manager. The only time we heard anything specifically about emergency management was in the context of FEMA, or our Federal Emergency Management Agency, failing at the response, failing at the recovery. And so I had this complete kind of lack of awareness about what emergency management was. And as we kind of watched this recovery unfold over the years that I was there, it was us literally picking up hammers and putting houses back together ourselves. It was us having to go and help homeowners fight with insurance companies, fight with FEMA over paperwork. And it was this awful process that we had to kind of watch New Orleanians go through as they tried to do anything and everything they could to rebuild their lives. And again, this is happening over many years. And so for a long time, as I had started that work, I thought that those failures that I was seeing in recovery were unique to New Orleans. I thought there was something about the city, whether it be kind of the politicians that were in charge, kind of the history of corruptness within the city of New Orleans, politicians, or something kind of unique to New Orleans, maybe just because it was this catastrophic event that was so much bigger than other disasters that had happened. But I thought that recovery in other places did not go this way. I thought it went better, because surely disasters happen, and surely we should have a plan for how we recover from these types of events. And it wasn't until 2010, when the BP oil disaster happened along the coast of Louisiana, that I started to kind of question if what was happening was really unique to New Orleans. I had been working with a number of environmental nonprofits in New Orleans, integrating sustainability efforts into the recovery efforts from Katrina. And when BP happened, it started affecting the Louisiana coast about an hour outside of New Orleans. And so we started driving down there, helping with community organizing, helping with media outreach, helping document impacts that folks along the coast were experiencing. And so for the first time, I had this kind of front row seat to an actual response. I hadn't gotten to New Orleans until it was well into the recovery. But with BP, I was there watching all of these different government agencies come into Louisiana. I was watching the friction and tension between the nonprofit sector, the businesses that were involved, the corporations that were involved, and these multiple levels of government that were coming in. And in watching this, in some ways, kind of a classic disaster response unfold, I saw that those coordination issues, those communication issues, those issues of trust and leadership and collaboration that had been such a focal point of failure during the recovery in New Orleans were also playing out in this response to BP. And so I started to kind of question and rethink this idea that these problems were unique to the city of New Orleans, and thought, well, maybe this is a Louisiana problem, right? Maybe this is this state in particular. Again, the state level government is having some influence. Again, is it just because now we've had two major disasters in Louisiana in only 5 years? Is that what's happening? And so again, I was kind of questioning why these failures were happening, but I still had this very limited kind of big picture understanding of emergency management and these other kind of outside factors that are influencing it. So in 2011, a town called Joplin, which is in Missouri, kind of right in the middle of the United States in the Midwest, had a massive tornado that devastated a chunk of this city. And I led a group of volunteers to Joplin, Missouri in the aftermath to help with their recovery. And we got there, and I don't know what I was necessarily expecting, but I wasn't expecting it to look the way that recovery had looked in New Orleans and in Louisiana following Katrina and BP. I thought this is on scale, a smaller disaster. There has been a seemingly greater federal presence in the response. And this is in Missouri, it's outside of Louisiana. These problems shouldn't be there. And when I got to Joplin, I was at the time very shocked to find that actually those core problems that I had seen in New Orleans and seen on the coast of Louisiana were very much present in Joplin. They certainly were on a smaller scale as the disaster was, but those same problems of coordination, communication, that friction between those different sectors that were involved in the recovery were all viscerally present. The survivors of the Joplin tornado were struggling to get the resources that they needed. In a similar way to how New Orleanians had been struggling to get resources in the wake of Katrina. And although there were certainly differences, my overall sense was that these three events that I had seen that seemed very different actually had more in common than they had different. And to me, that was kind of the red flag that this is not a problem of a specific city or state in the United States. This is a United States problem. The way that we are approaching response, the way we are approaching recovery in the United States isn't working for anyone in any of these events. So what's going on? That indicates that that's not a problem of those local communities. That indicates that that is a problem of the overarching system. So as I started specifically studying disaster management, went to grad school to actually learn about this much broader emergency management system, how this system was supposed to work, I have been very fortunate to be able to have the opportunity to get to know colleagues all around the world that are working in the field of disaster management, and began to kind of hear from them these very similar stories about needs not being met, these challenges of coordination and communication. I went to India in 2018 to speak at a disaster management conference there after really bad flooding in Kerala in 2018. And there I heard from India's National Emergency Management Agency, heard from the local folks in the areas that had been affected, spoke with volunteers, students that had been directly involved in that response. And all the way on the other side of the world in India, I felt like I was standing in New Orleans post-Katrina. It was the exact same issues being raised again and again and again. And so my understanding of this as kind of being a US problem shifted yet again to this is a global problem. And on the one hand, that is very overwhelming, right? To think and to understand that in perhaps most places in the world, we are, facing these dire challenges within disaster management on these kind of multiple levels. But on the other hand, that is perhaps something that is can be used to our advantage. I think we have often tended to silo our understanding of emergency management in particular regions of countries, among particular countries, but these really are global problems. And I think there's a lot of power in understanding that and sharing lessons, sharing research, sharing resources, sharing an understanding of what is and is not working, and how to make changes as you go from one place to another. So as we're looking at emergency management, I don't think it's any shock to anyone here that there are many kind of known issues within our approach to disaster management. I picked kind of what I consider to be the big three. This could be a much, much, much longer list, of course. But these are the three for me that are have been very persistent across time and have been persistent across geographic region. So certainly there are these basic kind of operational challenges in how we are approaching particularly response and recovery, these issues of coordination, communication, leadership, trust, how we're all working together, how our plans, our preparedness efforts are or are not being implemented when a crisis occurs. These are kind of those foundational challenges of our fields that have long been noted, that we have extensive research that has looked at these challenges. And these for me are kind of our forever challenges that we're always having to address in our day-to-day work. We also, of course, have been taking, and maybe I'll speak specifically to the US here, but we have taken an inequitable approach to all phases of disaster management. We are not approaching mitigation to the extent that we are in a way that is equitable. When you look at research of which communities are receiving mitigation dollars, it is very clear that this is going to the wealthier, whiter communities within the United States. Those resources are not accessible to all. Similarly, with preparedness, of course, who has the resources to actually prepare? Which communities have the resources to be doing this community level preparedness? How much money those communities have to actually invest in their emergency management agencies and build this, to actually do that planning, to be doing those trainings, exercises, those traditional preparedness tasks. And then, of course, we see inequalities in response in terms of who is impacted, who is able to get aid first, who is able to get aid most quickly. And in recovery, again, we see these clear disparities along the lines of race, class, and gender, and who is able to get those resources, how they are able to move through that recovery process, what that recovery experience is actually like for them. And then, of course, we have this, again, kind of broad, overarching issue of our long history of taking this very reactive approach to disaster management as opposed to being more proactive. This is something that sometimes I'll go back and read research from the 1960s, and it is written exactly like this, right? This is not by any means a new problem, but this idea that we wait for the disaster to happen, we react to it when it does, but we are not investing in mitigation. We're not investing in preventing these disasters from happening in the first place. We're not implementing the research that tells us how we can do that. We're not implementing the technical expertise and the advice from local communities on how these events can be prevented. So what I will say is that, look, there are no easy fixes to even these kind of basic and long known problems in emergency management. If there were easy fixes, I think we would have done them by now. And so that can be hard, right? As we, want to be solution oriented and we want to think about how we can do this work better. It's hard to kind of find right answers here. So in my experience, I think there are kind of two root fixes to many of our problems, those that I mentioned, but kind of also the longer list that we skipped over. I think there are these two kind of root solutions to this: education and policy change. And neither one of these is easy by any means. I don't want to give that impression, but I think that if there is a pathway out of this, if there is a pathway to fixing this, that it is going to be through education and policy change. And so I want to kind of spend a time talking about this. This is a model, some of you may be familiar with this. A couple other disaster researchers have kind of put this together over the years. But this is, I call it the identities model of disaster management. And so this is just a visualization of how the many stakeholders that are involved in this work kind of come together and hopefully interact with one another. So we have the discipline of disaster management, how we're, the act of actually studying this. We have the profession of disaster management, the people who work in these agencies, planners, right, the folks that are doing disaster work kind of day to day. And then we have the function, which incorporates everyone else, everybody from businesses to nonprofits, other government agencies, to individuals that are participating in a response when something happens, who are advocating for mitigation, who are doing various types of preparedness efforts ahead of time. All of that work is falling into this function category. And I think this is a useful visualization because it identifies, one, how we're not all coming from the same place. The people who are working within this function, perhaps they have some background in disasters, perhaps they have some experience with disaster management, maybe they have some idea of what that is. But the vast majority of people that are in this function, and also the vast majority of people that are actually doing disaster work, do not come from a disaster management background. When I first started in New Orleans, I was, as a volunteer in recovery, was fully operating within this kind of function. I had no awareness that there were people studying disasters. I had very little awareness of there even being a profession of emergency management. And I think it's really easy for people to kind of get lost within this function and to see these problems kind of piling on, experience these problems themselves, and not be able to kind of find the door out of that and find a door to the people who do have a better understanding and this like bigger kind of depth of expertise about how we manage these events and why what is happening. So of course, the discipline and the profession. And so as you know, we're kind of looking at this model, you'll notice these double-ended arrows here representing the need for these three identities to communicate with one another. I think in the past, particularly in the past 10 years or so, the emphasis has really been on finding this, a good equilibrium between the discipline and the profession, opening lines of communication so that research can move into practice and the experience of practitioners can inform the work that is being done within the discipline. But and that's good, right? Obviously, that is important. And to the extent that we've done that, I think certainly today we're doing better at that than we have historically. But I think that there has been much less focus on how we as the profession and the discipline communicate with the function and the kind of the public, that everybody else that is doing emergency management. And I think so much of our frustration is that these arrows between the discipline or going into the function, these arrows is a place where maybe we've had individual efforts to do this, but I don't know that we've really had kind of a collective effort to address this pathway of communication, particularly researchers to the function. When, I see, I'll speak for myself, but also when I see other disaster researchers reaching out to the public, talking to nonprofits, talking to businesses about the work that they're doing, it is almost always these one-off talks that we're given. It's done in this very limited way. And it's done in a way that's almost just by chance, right? You happen upon somebody on Twitter and you invite them to give a talk. It's this much more kind of informal approach that we've taken. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for the discipline to continue to support the profession, but certainly for the discipline to branch out and speak more directly with the public, speak more directly with these many different groups and many different stakeholders that are actually out there on the ground doing the work of disaster management. And there's a way for us to be doing that in a more coordinated, kind of strategic way than we've been able to do to this point. I also, fully recognize that the profession works with these various stakeholders. One obvious way is to encourage the engagement of these stakeholders to participate in planning efforts, preparedness efforts, certainly education campaigns of various kinds. But again, it has been relatively limited. And again, I'll speak just to the United States here. I'm not sure the way we've approached this to now has been very effective. When you look at kind of the hazard literacy across the United States, it's still quite minimal, considering how long we've known that an education and a background in disasters is helpful and is an element of preparedness and a kind of a precursor to that public engagement. It's still limited, right? And so there's, I think, a lot of work that can be done on all of these arrows, all of these relationships, but particularly in how the discipline and the profession is working into the function. So I have kind of three ideas here of moving forward, what it is that we need to do to hopefully move us into the future to be able to actually address this increasing risk that we have globally. So I'll talk through each of these kind of three categories and give you some initial thoughts, but would love feedback and to hear your thoughts as we move into questions and answers. So in terms of thinking about policy change, I think this is sometimes an area that folks in disaster management get a little nervous about. And I think the reason for that is because this kind of traditional role and this traditional mindset about who a disaster manager is and what it is that they're supposed to be doing. When we look back historically, we see that disaster management agencies, disaster managers have a relatively limited involvement in emergency management, right? Which maybe sounds a little silly, but the majority of this work is being done by the people that fall into this function category. And so disaster managers are there, right? They're behind the scenes, but they're not always the driving force of the work that is actually being done in disaster management, which again can sometimes I think be a little bit of a hard thing to hear. But when we look at kind of what it is that an emergency manager does day to day, it is very focused on response, very focused on kind of these very traditional preparedness activities for response, not looking at preparedness for recovery nearly as much. And it's really kind of operating within this very rigid understanding of what preparedness is, and this need to spend so much time on response, so much time doing trainings and exercises and planning. Obviously, those are all good and important things to do, but we're really kind of quite limited in how we think about those activities and how we think about what the role of disaster managers are in those activities. We also, of course, have this persistent problem of not having enough financial resources, not having enough staff, lacking access to data, technical expertise that is needed within these agencies. This is we're not going to get anywhere on these other issues until we address this lack of financial resources. We have to be building the capacity of our disaster management agencies for us to be able to move forward. We have in the United States, I'm not exactly sure what this looks like in the UK, but in the United States, we have communities that have a part-time emergency manager who is also the fire chief and is at most spending 15 hours a week on preparedness. God forbid a disaster actually happens and they're stuck in response. They have no clue what's going on in recovery. And there is absolutely no hope of them having any time to even apply for a mitigation grant. We even have some communities in the United States where there is a volunteer disaster manager, somebody who is just volunteering their time. They don't have the time, they don't have the expertise, they don't have the resources to be doing these bare minimum tasks that need to be done related to mitigation, response, recovery, and preparedness. And so until we build those capacities of those agencies, everything else is going to be relatively impossible to address. We need more people doing this work, and we need the financial support to do this work. And of course, the other issue here is this kind of lack of authority that disaster managers have, especially, or I'll again speak to the United States. These positions come with very little authority. You are still having to go to your mayor or your local government to be able to implement any changes, implement projects, implement programs that you are wanting to do, which is fine, right? You want that stakeholder involvement. But if you have a local government who does not, for whatever reason, support that work, doesn't understand that work, then there isn't much that you as a disaster manager can do. Or traditionally, there hasn't been much that you as a disaster manager can do. But I think, so that's a very, again, kind of a long kind of, or a generalization of kind of this traditional role. And as we are thinking about where we are now, I see a lot of shifts happening within these agencies, within how we are thinking about what exactly the job of a disaster manager is in this era of increasing risk. There was, I think, a time where if you had an emergency manager in your community, great. But if you didn't, maybe that was okay too. Disasters were happening so infrequently that if a disaster happened, you could fall back on our old mindset of, well, it was a natural disaster. Nobody could have predicted this. There's nothing we could have done. These things just happen. And I think that there was kind of a level of forgiveness among the public that, yeah, okay, who could have predicted this? This is just a natural occurrence. This is an act of God. And so the social expectations were not as, were not as, are not what they are now. Now, when disasters happen, there is this greater understanding among the public, particularly in terms of the role of climate change in many of these disasters, that no, that these are not natural events that are occurring, that there are policy decisions that could have been made to have different outcomes, that there are individuals, there are corporations that are responsible for these events, and that that these are not these unpredictable events that are happening. You can look back now and see the warnings that researchers or practitioners gave about what risks exist, what potential threats there were. And there's, I think, more of a kind of a paper trail that the public can access now that has led to this shift in social expectations about what it is we expect, not only from disaster management, but from government more broadly. And so I think we're starting to see some changes. We're starting to see that there is this much more significant involvement of emergency management agencies. They're not necessarily just this little office of one guy who gets shoved away in a government building basement somewhere to write out a plan by themselves. There is a growing kind of understanding that these are the people that are going to be front and center at press conferences when disasters happen. These are people who are going to be answering to the public when these events happen. Certainly, there is a need for us to be focusing across phases. But I think, and that again is a long known need, but I do think, again, in this context of climate change, the more that we can attach the need and the benefits of hazard mitigation to this broader climate conversation, that there's real opportunity to potentially be able to move mitigation more to the forefront than we have been historically. I do think there's potentially a little bit of danger of attaching it so directly to climate, in the fact that, of course, climate change is not the only factor in causing our risk. There's obviously all of these other factors that we need to be addressing, but I think there's a potential kind of policy window here for really emphasizing mitigation and potentially increasing resources available for mitigation. As I mentioned earlier, certainly we see this rapidly growing need for financial resources, robust staff. I think there are important questions here about increasing the authority of disaster managers. Certainly, these positions are becoming increasingly political, I think, much to the chagrin of many disaster managers. But I don't think there's any denying anymore that that there is a political piece of this job, and that role is growing. And in coinciding with that, I think we're starting to see this movement from kind of just the operational side of emergency management into this policy arena. There is this greater recognition that it is policy that is dictating our risk, that is leading to these events, leading to whether or not we have the resources to respond and recover from these events. And as emergency managers are having to manage more of these events, as we're seeing that shift in social expectations among the public, this push into the policy arena is kind of happening whether emergency managers want it to happen or not. And I think there's a real opportunity to be very active and to kind of grab onto that and try and kind of take control of that role, take control of that narrative, and use, again, kind of this potential window of opportunity here to push for this policy change that we have long known is needed. I do also think that there is kind of these two related roles here of emergency managers. Again, I think we've seen folks in this field kind of try to stay a little bit more in the background, wanting to be kind of the behind the scenes people who are coordinating efforts, who are doing those planning efforts, and not necessarily wanting to be front and center, not wanting to necessarily be in the camera. But I think that because there is a lack of other people that are providing kind of this moral and ethical guidance in terms of disasters, and that there is a lack of people that are providing a narrative of disasters in a way that makes sense to the public, I think there's an opportunity for disaster managers to step in and fulfill some of that role. And that, again, would be extremely new, and it would be something that I think would maybe be kind of uncomfortable for a lot of emergency managers. But I think it also is kind of the point that we are at, right? There is this void of leadership when it comes to disaster management for any number of reasons, whether that leadership should be coming from politicians, coming from the media, coming from other community leaders, whatever that source should be. I think we have to face this reality that it isn't there, and somebody needs to be stepping in to fulfill those roles. I'll move kind of quickly through this point. We don't really have a lobby for emergency management, not in the way other industries like healthcare does, for example. In terms of who is advocating for disaster management within government, it is potentially disaster managers, various types of associations, of course, but I have not found too many associations that actually have very much political power or have very much political sway, even though they are very often correct. And then there are maybe, I'm being generous here, a handful of politicians that have even any kind of basic understanding of how big our problems are in emergency management. And there really isn't anyone else. And that is kind of, again, a forever problem if we're looking at how we can enact policy change. Going this kind of traditional route of doing political lobbying, I don't know that power actually resides there. And so for me, and perhaps I am biased because I come out of a community organizing background, but for me, I see the potential for policy change to come out of some kind of movement for disaster justice. I see this as being more of a grassroots kind of uprising, if you will, of recognizing what our problems are, recognizing that our policies, our politicians are not utilizing the resources and the talents that we do have, not implementing the research that we have, not using our plans, not preparing correctly, but also in understanding that this system that we have, one, is a system, right? Raising that awareness that this is an overarching system, but also, have them understand that we can change that system, that this system is not set in stone. We can change our policies. We can do reform to change the way we create risk, to change the way we prepare for it, the way we respond to it, the way we recover from it. And I have started to see kind of these very faint threads of such a movement starting in the United States. Going back to Katrina, you can see that there was all of this community organizing, all of this community advocacy work, to the point that it changed the way Congress approached funding the recovery. You can look to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, see the kind of uprising and movement that began there in the wake of Maria. You can also connect this to kind of other protests and other movements within the United States, specifically the March for Our Lives movement, for advocating for gun control. That is kind of falling within this category. Standing Rock, of course, fighting oil pipeline development and the climate movement more broadly. Of course, you can look back to the 70s and kind of the modern day environmental movement and the advocacy work that was done through those movements. And so there are these clear connections across existing movements. You can start to see these threads. You can start to see these local organizations beginning to network with one another across the country, around the world. And I think that if there is leadership, if there is support from people within the discipline, people within the profession, who again have this depth of expertise about how this overarching system works, but there is a lot of potential here in involving the public and having the public lead these changes that are needed within emergency management. Again, because many of these changes are these much bigger kind of shifts in our thinking, right, of being proactive versus being reactive. Some of these changes, right, are these more nitty-gritty operational things, but a lot of this is about changing the emphasis on what we're prioritizing and how we're using our resources. So just a final thought here, we have to address the fundamental issues that have always been a problem for disaster management. That has always been true, but now because of our rapidly changing risks, we have to think beyond those challenges, and we need to create a vision for our field that is up to the job of managing our 21st century risk. This is, I talk about how disaster management is on the front lines of the climate crisis. It is folks in disaster management that is that frontline system of responding to some of these early consequences of the climate crisis. And again, we need to be active participants in that. We cannot just be passive and sit back and think we're going to do things the way we've always done them. It's already not working for us, and it's not going to continue to work for us into the future. And so I think our perhaps biggest challenge of all is actually developing this vision for our field, reimagining what disaster management could be and what we need it to be. So I'll stop there and we can do some questions if you have them.
Thank you. Sam, are you able to see the questions in the Q&A, or would you like me to read them out?
Yes, I can see the questions here. Hang on, let me read. Okay, so can everybody see the questions, or should I read them?
I'll read them. I just want to give you. If we go for the bottom one last.
Okay, go ahead.
Do you think we struggle to be heard by policymakers as planners? Because what we need to talk about are things people don't want to think about, but we have to.
The short answer is yes. Yeah, of course, right? This is exactly why, they try to shove emergency managers in the basements of government buildings, right? So they don't need to hear from us. We are going to policymakers with kind of this long list of needs, this long, oftentimes expensive list of needs. We're telling them that they need to change the way they're doing things. We are very often telling them that they cannot, do the development project or should not do the development project that they have in mind. That the way they're letting industry behave unregulated is causing a risk, right? There are all of these things that we're saying to them that are not things politicians want to hear. And that is going to continue to be true. But again, this is why I think this change in public expectations is really important. I I don't know how much longer some of these politicians are going to be able to get away with ignoring some of these problems within emergency management. And again, this may be kind of unique to the US context here, but you have states like Louisiana right now, where last year they had 3 landfall hurricanes on the western side of the state. They just had Hurricane Ida on the eastern side of the state. Essentially, the entire coast of Louisiana needs to be rebuilt again. And this is, you know, as there are still people 16 years later rebuilding from Katrina. They had flooding in 2016 in the middle part of the state. So the middle part of the state also had to be completely rebuilt. You know, we're talking about numbers here that are so extreme in certain places that at some point politicians are going to become more willing, I think, to hear these things. They're probably still not going to like it, but I think that there is the potential for some shifts moving forward.
Thank you, and that was brilliant. I was also quote tweeting you at the same time in just a state of excitement. Oh my goodness. And you know, that kind of anthem that at some point in the very near future, politicians are going to have to start listening to us. You know, that what an anthem. Helen asks, does Sam think that the UN approach to disaster risk reduction could be more helpful in shaping the conversations around disaster management as she defines it?
Yes. Again, short answer, yes, probably. Again, I think maybe this is a little bit specific to the US, but you know, disaster risk reduction is not a term that is really used in the United States at all. Again, I think it speaks to that mindset, right? And historically in the US, of being very reactive, of thinking about, you know, only managing a disaster when it happens and kind of ignoring the before and ignoring the after. Certainly just in the language of the difference between those two terms, disaster risk reduction places that emphasis on mitigation. It places that emphasis on being proactive. So even if the kind of tasks you end up doing are similar, it again is speaking to that kind of mind, that shift that has to happen in the mind among the profession, but also among the public.
Thank you, Sam. And there's so much reaction to me quote tweeting you about shoving us in the basement. Clearly, I've tweeted you hitting a nerve of this profession, because that's exactly how we feel. And I think deep within our souls, we knew that it was a metaphor, you know, for perhaps how we feel about how we are viewed. And you know, it was interesting. We had a government civil servant speak this morning, and it was a brilliant talk. We've all taken a lot from it. But one of the things that really struck me was he said, you know, if you've got issues, bring them to us in private, which was totally meant well and very well, you know, understood. But one of the things that I struggle with is we've always played the game as disaster managers. You know, only in the last couple of years have I joined Twitter, for example. Only in the last couple of years have I done a couple of occasional naughty TV interviews. I've played the game very well for what was 19 years and then went rogue in the last 2, entirely inspired by you, Sam. And I think, you know, this playing the game point is really difficult when you're watching communities be destroyed over and over again. And the message sometimes from government is play the game. You can sit at the top tables. I know you had some extensive threads on when Biden was forming his government, you know, and that sort of patronage. If you, I'm reaching it. You didn't say this, but if you play the game, you can be in the right committees. And I think that's something that I'm really reflecting on at this point in my career. You know, who was I speaking for at those various points? So I think a lot of us are really, really hearing that message about where we're put in the government building. And I've got one more, I think, that went off into answered. Where's it gone? Do you think this is do you think the tensions and challenges in engaging the profession to the function are different in the UK? We don't see perhaps the devastation you saw after Katrina. Is it because there are less people in the UK doing the function? Or do you think this difficulty to engage is standard?
Well, I think the difficulty I mean, I don't know, you guys tell me, but I would say the difficulty to engage is pretty standard place to place, right? Because no matter where you are, the perspectives of nonprofits, the things they care about, the approach that they're taking is different than the way businesses approach things, is different than the way government approaches things. So I think those tensions are pretty universal. I do, though, take the point that certainly in the US, as a much larger country with these, a greater number of disasters occurring in terms of frequency and in terms of size, that I think it can be more pronounced here. But I mean, I think even if you look at the pandemic response, you can see the kind of battling between these different areas.
Thank you. And I think this ongoing discussion, one of the great things, Sam, about an emergency planning conference is that we absolutely epitomise the chaired session of it's more of a comment than a question. Over in the chat at the moment, there's a lot of brilliant commentary, and of course one of those things is on the definition, and this got very personal for me in the pandemic because I was doing government advice, Prime Minister's office, Department for Education, Department for Health, and one of the things that they kept saying to me, as I went to different meetings, I would be handled or ruffled or whatever the word is, fluffed before I went into the next stage of government. And they would say, please don't use disaster. Or actually they'd say disaster. Please don't use disaster because this isn't one. This pandemic isn't one. And you keep bringing your disaster tools and this isn't a disaster and it's something else. Please stop saying that. And eventually this year, they've said, oh no, you can come with your disaster tools after all. We're willing to think of it as a disaster. So there's a lot of discussion from wonderful people in the chat about that definition. I've used disaster more on the Twitter just so I can engage more globally, because I'm aware that emergency management, as we use it, can be very parochial. But your book, as I've taken great comfort from, does talk about definitions a lot. So do you want to come in on that sort of general theme in the chat?
Yeah, certainly. Again, this is another area where, because we have so many different stakeholders, as we have people talking about disasters coming from these different disciplines, coming from different parts of the world, the terminology that we use gets very bogged down and can lead to very heated debates, right? We have entire books that have been written that are called What is a Disaster?, where you have academics going back and forth trying to find some kind of consensus about these terms. As an academic, I'm very interested in that kind of conceptual kind of debate and conversation that happens. I think when we're thinking kind of externally, thinking within the profession, thinking of especially among the public, I think that we want to be really careful to think about what is our end goal, right? So I have a kind of like a very specific definition in my head of which events are an emergency versus a disaster versus a catastrophe, that is like based off of work done in the 1970s, 1980s by Dr. Quarantelli, right? That is kind of my conceptual understanding of these different events. And if I talk about that in my book because I have the space to do it. But when I am doing an interview on the radio and we have 5 minutes, that's not going to be the thing that I take the time on to explain, right? I'm going to just say disaster because that's the term that the public best understands, even if what we're talking about is really technically a catastrophe or really technically, one of these other kind of categories. So I think there is like a level of decision making that has to happen there when you're thinking about who your audience is, when you're thinking about who you're talking to. But this is particularly important, and you kind of see the consequences of understanding these conceptualizations of these terms when you start talking about something like the pandemic, right? Again, I'll speak to the US here, but I think as kind of a similar situation happened in the UK, is that when the pandemic began, there was a question within the Trump administration at the time of whether or not they were going to use the Stafford Act, which is what dictates emergency management policy in the United States. We had existing plans, existing programs. We have this entire existing system set up across the country to respond to an event exactly like the pandemic. But because the word pandemic was not actually written in the Stafford Act, there was a question, there was like a legal debate. There was a question over whether or not we would actually activate our system and actually use emergency management to respond. And it led to a delay, a very important delay that, we lost days that could have really, really mattered last March in the United States, because it was not, apparently it was not perceived to be this disaster, or politicians did not want to admit that that is what was happening. And so there was a tangible consequence that resulted in people misunderstanding what we mean by disaster, or, willingly not using that term in the way that it should have been used. And so there is this, it's not only a matter of semantics, right? There are real consequences to these terms and how we use them. And I saw Louise mention it in the chat that the Quarantelli definition is really debated too, which is certainly right. I don't think there is a perfect answer here. I think what's important is that we acknowledge kind of how we have to define these terms as we go, right? We have to say, I'm talking about disasters in this way, and like, here you go. And then, the next person needs to do the same. I potentially at some point we'll reach a better consensus than we are at. But until that happens, I think just being really, really good about clarifying how we're using these terms is kind of how we can move forward.
Oh, wow. I mean, that definitions debate has just done something wonderfully quasi-religious and funny to all of our members. Not sure the wonderful Dr. Hugh Deeming's ever going to be the same again. That we could just listen to you for days. And in a very non-threatening way, Sam, I am planning to find you. I will get to you. I love that we can do these conferences and that they are online, because it makes it easier. But in the future will definitely be that we get to you and you get to us, because from your Twitter thread I can tell you're a very good night out. So we are going to take you out on the town. A really thought-provoking point from Debbie, who I know has been right in the thick of a very difficult incident the last few weeks, that one of the biggest challenges she finds as an emergency management professional, one of the very best I've ever worked with, if I may say, is how we are still immersed in responding to an emergency while the rest of the country has moved on to the next headline, leaving the affected community in its wake. The disaster is not over, says Helen, because the cameras have left. And I've seen Sam's writing on this very issue. One thing Sam does incredibly well is, whereas I have an idea and I tend to tweet a single tweet and then wander off because it's sort of tea time or something, Sam constructs the most perfect threads. Having listened to a talk today, you will be able to understand what I mean. She's also the first person I've ever really seen who can properly deconstruct some of these debates that we've had and sort of almost put them to bed. I think some of the disaster scholars of previous generations have drawn them out for much longer than they should have been. And what I've come to really admire, because it's something I most certainly do not have, is a clarity of thought that so few people have in this field. And Sam, you have epitomized that today. We would like to make you our first author of our inaugural EP book club. We've been running it online, but we're going to run it in person with cocktails, because we know you will approve. And if we can try and get the time difference arranged, maybe you could come and say hello at the end. Please do get
Absolutely.
a copy of Sam's book. You can also sign up to her newsletter, which is wonderful at a Disasterology link, and please do follow her on the Twitter. But Sam, thank you so much for joining us today. You have been electric, as I knew you would be. Please take care of yourself. The toll on our workers and our academics. I know you also have a very full-on academic life as well, raising the next generation of disaster managers. So take care and go safe, and thank you from us all.
Thanks, everyone. See you later.
Right, we're back on track, people. You can get a... What's that, Louise Elster, about vertebrates? What do we do? Louise, what have I told you? We're not going to institutional ecology. Oh my goodness. Right. Anyway, yeah, back to Spotify. Thank you, Casey, for bringing us back there. Oh, go on then, Louise. Oh no, you can't speak. That's the whole point. But we'll make sure, actually, I will make you a panelist at 3:30, Louise, so you can explain. Okay, so we now actually get a genuine pee break, and you can grab something more wholesome than a packet of crisps. Thank you for posting me your pictures of your packets of crisps. You have until 2 o'clock, please. So that's 23 minutes. I'll see you in 23 minutes with a few more planthums. See you then.